The wagon wheels groaned against the hard-pan earth, each rotation dragging Margaret Caldwell further from everything she had known. Red dust rose in choking clouds, settling into the creases of her black dress, the same dress she'd worn to bury her husband 3 months prior. She didn't mourn him. That truth sat heavy in her chest, heavier than the bruises that had finally faded from her ribs. The convoy of 12 wagons stretched across the Nebraska plains like a centipede crawling toward an uncertain horizon. Margaret rode in the 7th wagon, having paid the last of her savings to Mr. Josiah Hendricks for passage west. The other travelers kept their distance, whispering about the young widow who never smiled, who clutched her carpet bag as if it held the secrets of the world. It held only a change of clothes, $43, and a letter from her sister in California, a sister she hadn't seen in 8 years. Mrs. Caldwell. The voice belonged to Emma Winters, a minister's wife traveling with her husband and 3 children. Would you care for some cornbread fresh made this morning? Margaret shook her head, managing what she hoped was a grateful smile. Thank you kindly, but I'm not hungry. Emma's eyes, kind but probing, lingered on Margaret's face. You've barely eaten since we left Independence. A body needs strength for the journey ahead. I said I'm fine. The words came out sharper than intended, and Margaret immediately softened her tone. I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Winters. Truly. Emma retreated, and Margaret turned her attention back to the endless expanse of prairie grass bending before the wind. She had learned long ago that kindness often came with questions, and questions led to truth she couldn't afford to share. Nobody needed to know about the night Samuel Caldwell had come home reeking of whiskey and rage. Nobody needed to know about the morning she'd found him at the bottom of the stairs, neck twisted at an impossible angle, or how she'd stood there for a full minute before calling for help. The sun climbed higher, a merciless eye watching their slow progress. Margaret's throat burned with thirst, but water was rationed, and she'd already had her morning share. She thought of the well behind their farmhouse in Missouri, how she used to draw bucket after bucket for Samuel's horses, while her own lips cracked with thirst. Everything had been Samuel's: the house, the horses, even her. Not anymore. Indians! The cry came from the lead wagon, and Margaret's blood turned to ice. She'd heard stories in Independence painted savages who burned wagons and stole women, but when she craned her neck to look, she saw only a distant line of riders on a far ridge, watching their passage with the stillness of carved stone. Probably Pawnee, said Tom Morrison, the wagon master's assistant, riding past on his bay mare. They won't bother us if we don't bother them. The riders remained on the ridge until sunset. When the wagons circled for the night, Margaret helped gather buffalo chips for the fires, the dried dung crumbling in her hands. Everything out here was about survival, stripped down to its meanest form. She found a strange comfort in that simplicity. As darkness fell, she sat apart from the others, watching the flames dance. The families clustered together, children nestled between parents, voices soft with exhaustion and affection. Margaret wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Though the night wasn't cold, some chills came from inside. You planning to sit out here all night? She startled at Tom Morrison's voice. He stood just beyond the firelight, his weathered face half in shadow. I like the quiet, she said. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Fair enough, but you might want to keep your pistol handy. Heard tell there's been trouble up ahead, bandits hitting the smaller convoys. Margaret's hand moved instinctively to her carpet bag. The Colt .31 pocket revolver was wrapped in cotton at the bottom. Samuel's gun that he'd taught her to shoot one sunny afternoon before the darkness took hold of him. She'd become a good shot. Had to be. I'll keep that in mind, Mr. Morrison. He tipped his hat and moved on, leaving her alone with the vast prairie night. Stars crowded the sky, more than she'd ever seen in Missouri. Out here, the universe showed its true face: infinite, indifferent, honest. 3 days later, the storm hit. It started as a brown smudge on the horizon, growing into a wall of dust and wind that struck the convoy with biblical fury. Margaret huddled in the wagon as it rocked and groaned, sand finding every gap in the canvas, coating her mouth and nose until breathing became a conscious effort. She heard children crying, oxen bellowing, men shouting orders that the wind tore away. When it finally passed, 2 wagons had broken axles. Tom Morrison called a halt for repairs, but time was pressing. They were already behind schedule, and the mountain passes would be impassable if the early snows came. "We can't wait," Josiah Hendricks declared. "Those who can travel must continue. We'll send help back from Fort Laramie." Margaret watched the debate unfold, seeing her fate decided by men who barely knew her name. When the convoy split, she found herself among the 3 wagons forced to remain behind. The Winters family was one, their youngest child burning with fever. The other was an elderly couple named Patterson, whose wagon had suffered the worst damage. As the main convoy disappeared into the distance, Margaret felt the first real fingers of fear close around her throat. They were 30 miles from Fort Laramie. Tom Morrison had said, 30 miles through hostile territory with limited water and a sick child. The attack came that night. They struck during the dog watch, that dead hour before dawn when vigilance falters. Margaret woke to gunfire and screaming, the thunder of hooves circling their small camp. Not Indians, white men with faces masked by bandanas, whooping like demons as they fired into the air. "Everyone out hands where we can see them." Margaret grabbed her pistol and crept to the wagon opening. In the flickering firelight, she counted 6 riders. "Reverend?" Winters stood with his hands raised, his wife clutching their children behind him. "Old Mister." Patterson lay motionless by his wagon. "Please." "Reverend," Winters said, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at his chest. "We're just travelers. We have little of value." The lead bandit dismounted, a tall man with cold eyes above his mask. "We'll be the judge of that. Preacher, start with the women, jewelry, money, anything worth taking." Margaret's finger found the trigger. She could drop maybe 2 before they got her. But what then? What would happen to Emma Winters and the children? She made her choice. Leaving the pistol hidden in the folds of her skirt, she climbed down from the wagon. Well. The leader's eyes found her, and she recognized the look, the same hungry gaze Samuel used to get. "What have we here?" "A widow," she said, keeping her voice flat, "with nothing but the clothes on my back." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey and tobacco on him. "Pretty widow. Might be you're worth more than whatever coins you're hiding." Margaret's hand tightened on the concealed pistol. One shot, right through the pocket of her skirt. But before she could act, a rifle cracked from the darkness beyond the camp. The bandit leader spun and fell, clutching his shoulder. Another shot dropped a second man from his horse. The remaining bandits fired wildly into the night, their horses dancing with panic. "Ride out," one shouted. "It's a trap." They fled into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving their wounded leader writhing on the ground. Margaret kicked his gun away and turned to see who had saved them. A lone figure emerged from the shadows, rifle balanced easy in his hands. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, each step deliberate and silent. As he entered the firelight, Margaret saw a face carved by wind and sun, dark hair hanging past his collar, eyes the color of winter stone. He wore no uniform, but something in his bearing spoke of military training. Mixed blood, she realized, seeing the sharp angles of his face, white and Indian both, belonging fully to neither world. Without a word, he knelt beside the wounded bandit and checked his pulse, satisfied the man would live. He stood and surveyed the camp, his gaze lingering on each person before settling on Margaret. She met his eyes without flinching, and something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, though they'd never met. The recognition of one survivor seeing another. "You folks hurt?" His voice was low, roughened by disuse. "Mr. Patterson's dead," "Reverend," Winters said. "The rest of us." He looked at his family, his hands still trembling. "We're alive, thanks to you." The stranger nodded and walked to his horse, a paint mare that materialized from the darkness like a ghost. Margaret thought he would mount up and ride away, vanish like smoke into the prairie. Instead, he began gathering wood for the dying fire. "Long time till dawn," he said. "Best keep the flames high." Margaret found herself moving to help him, drawn by something she couldn't name. As she placed a branch on the fire, their hands nearly touched. He pulled back, a muscle tightening in his jaw. "Thank you," she said quietly. He looked at her then, truly looked, and she saw depths in those stone-colored eyes that matched her own. Pain, loss, something broken and hastily mended. "Ma'am," was all he said, touching the brim of his worn hat. But he stayed until dawn, a silent sentinel against the darkness. And when the sun finally broke the horizon, painting the grassland gold and scarlet, Margaret realized she felt safe for the first time in years. She didn't even know his name. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows across the prairie grass. Margaret sat with her back against a wagon wheel, watching the stranger tend to his rifle with practiced precision. The Winters family huddled together near their wagon, exhausted from terror and grief. They had buried Mr. Patterson at first light, Reverend Winters speaking words over the shallow grave while his wife tried to quiet their fevered child. The stranger, he still hadn't offered his name, worked in silence, cleaning each part of his weapon with methodical care. His hands were scarred, she noticed. The hands of a man who had held both tools and weapons, who had built and destroyed in equal measure. "You're military," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. His hands stilled for a moment before resuming their work. "Was cavalry, 7th Regiment, till I wasn't." She understood the weight of those words, the story buried beneath them. Men didn't leave the cavalry by choice. Not in these times. Desertion meant hanging if caught, a lifetime of running if not. "My husband was at Fort Gibson," she offered, surprising herself. She rarely spoke of Samuel to anyone. "Quartermaster's unit." The stranger's eyes flicked up to hers, reading something in her face. "Was," he repeated, and she heard the question he didn't ask. "Died 3 months past. Accident with the stairs." He nodded slowly, and she saw he understood that truth too. The kind of accident that happened to cruel men when their wives had finally had enough. But he said nothing, returning his attention to his rifle. "Reverend." Winters approached, his thin face drawn with worry. "Sir, I wonder if I might impose upon you further. My youngest, she's burning with fever. We have perhaps 2 days' worth of water, and Mrs. Patterson." He glanced toward the new widow, who sat staring at nothing. "She's in no state to travel alone. Would you consider guiding us to Fort Laramie?" The stranger's jaw tightened. "I'm not headed that way." "Of course, I understand." "Reverend." Winters turned to go, shoulders sagging. "But I know a spring," the stranger continued, surprising them all. "Half a day's ride north, clean water, sheltered. You could rest there, let the child recover strength before pushing on." Margaret watched him struggle with some internal decision, saw the moment he surrendered to it. He stood, slinging the rifle across his back. "Pack light, we move in an hour." They formed a strange procession across the grassland, 2 damaged wagons, a grieving widow, a minister's family with a sick child, and their nameless guardian riding point. Margaret had convinced Mrs. Patterson to ride in the Winters wagon, taking the reins of the elderly couple's rig herself. She'd driven Samuel's wagon often enough when he was too drunk to hold the lines. The stranger ranged ahead and to the sides, sometimes disappearing for an hour or more before materializing again like a hawk circling back to its territory. He spoke only when necessary, directing them around rough ground or pointing out landmarks. As the sun reached its zenith, he raised his hand for a halt. Margaret watched him dismount and study the ground, running his fingers through the dust. His face darkened. "What is it?" she asked, walking over to him. "Riders, maybe 20, passed through this morning." He stood, scanning the horizon. "Shod horses, moving fast." "The bandits." "No, these came from the east." His eyes met hers. "Someone's looking for something. Or someone." A chill ran down Margaret's spine despite the heat. She thought of the letter from California, of the things she hadn't told her sister. Samuel had debts. She knew. Men he'd cheated at cards. Deals gone wrong. She'd hoped his death would end it, but hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. They reached the spring as the afternoon sun slanted low. It was as promised a small oasis where water bubbled from a cluster of rocks, forming a pool before disappearing back into the earth. Cottonwoods provided shade, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind. "We'll camp here tonight," the stranger announced. It was the longest sentence he'd spoken all day. While Reverend Winters tended his daughter and Margaret helped Emma prepare a simple meal, the stranger disappeared into the gathering dusk. Margaret found herself watching for his return, startled by the relief she felt when he emerged from the shadows an hour later, carrying 2 rabbits. "For the child," he said, handing them to Emma. "Broth will help with the fever." He moved to the edge of the firelight, and Margaret followed with a plate of beans and hardtack. He looked up as she approached, something flickering in those stone-gray eyes. "You need to eat too," she said, holding out the plate. He took it reluctantly, their fingers brushing in the exchange. He jerked back as if burned, nearly dropping the food. "Thank you," he said stiffly. Margaret settled herself a careful distance away, close enough to talk, but not so close as to spook him. She recognized the wariness of a wounded animal, knew it from her own reflection. "You never told me your name," she said. "Didn't ask." "I'm asking now." He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, Kane, Elijah Kane. "Margaret Caldwell." She paused. "Though I suppose I'm not anymore. Not sure what I am now." "You're alive," he said simply. "That's enough." They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire die to embers. The spring gurgled softly, a sound that reminded Margaret of the creek behind her childhood home in Ohio, before her father's debts forced them west, before her mother's death, before Samuel. "Those riders," she said eventually. "You think they'll find us?" "Depends on what they're looking for." He glanced at her. "You running from something, Mrs. Caldwell?" "Aren't we all?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first she'd seen from him. "Fair point. What about you? What makes a man leave the cavalry and ride alone through hostile territory?" The almost smile vanished. "Orders I couldn't follow, things I couldn't unsee." He set aside the empty plate. "There's a reckoning coming between the whites and the tribes, has been building for years. When it comes, it'll be bloody. I wanted no part of making it worse." "So you deserted?" "So I left." His voice carried an edge of steel. "There's leaving with honor and leaving with a rope around your neck. I chose honor." Margaret heard what he didn't say, that the choice had cost him everything. Home, purpose, identity. She understood that loss intimately. "Where will you go?" He shrugged. "Mountains, maybe. Somewhere the past can't follow." "The past always follows," Margaret said softly. "The trick is learning to walk faster." He looked at her then, truly looked, and she felt exposed under that penetrating gaze. But she didn't look away. Let him see, she thought. Let someone finally see who she really was beneath the widow's weeds and proper manners. "You're not what you seem," he said finally. "Neither are you." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition that went deeper than words. Two people wearing masks they couldn't quite remove, playing roles that no longer fit. A cough from the Winters wagon broke the spell. Emma emerged, her face drawn with exhaustion. "The fever's broken," she announced. "Praise God. I think she'll be all right." Relief washed over the small camp. Even Mrs. Patterson stirred from her grief long enough to help Emma tend the child. Margaret found herself smiling, a real smile that felt foreign on her lips. She turned to share the moment with Cain, but he had retreated into the shadows beyond the firelight. She could just make out his silhouette against the stars, standing guard as he had the night before. Later, as the camp settled into sleep, Margaret lay wakeful in her wagon. Through a gap in the canvas, she could see Cain by the dying fire, a solitary figure carved from darkness and starlight. He sat with the stillness of stone, but she sensed the coiled readiness in him, the perpetual alertness of prey that had become predator to survive. She thought about his scarred hands, about orders he couldn't follow, about the way he'd flinched from her touch like a man who'd forgotten gentleness. She thought about the moment their eyes met and the strange flutter in her chest. Not fear this time, but something else. Something she'd thought Samuel had killed along with everything else. Near dawn, she woke to find him standing beside her wagon. His face was grim. "Riders coming," he said quietly. "From the east. Same group as yesterday." Margaret's heart hammered as she reached for her pistol. "How long?" "Hour, maybe less." He met her eyes. "They're tracking someone, Mrs. Caldwell, following wagon ruts. Question is, are they hunting you, or me?" Before she could answer, he moved away, rousing the others with quiet efficiency. As the camp stirred to anxious life, Margaret made a decision. Whatever came next, whatever price the past demanded, she wouldn't let these people pay it for her. She climbed down from the wagon, her pistol heavy in her pocket, and went to stand beside Elijah Cain. "Together?" she asked quietly. He looked at her, surprise flickering across his stoic features. Then he nodded, just once. "Together." The sun broke the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and blood. And in the distance, a dust cloud grew larger, carrying with it the promise of reckoning. The riders stopped just beyond rifle range. 22 men arranged in a loose semicircle. Their leader, a man with silver threading through his dark beard, rode forward under a white flag. Cain's hand tightened on his rifle, but he held his fire. "That's close enough," Cain called out. The man reined in his horse, raising both hands to show he meant no harm. "Name's Colonel Marcus Holstead. Retired, looking for my sister-in-law, Margaret Caldwell. I have reason to believe she's traveling with this party." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Not Samuel's debts, then Samuel's brother, the one who'd written after the funeral, asking questions about the will, about the property, about the circumstances of his brother's death. "I'm here, Marcus," she said, stepping forward before Cain could stop her. Marcus Holstead's eyes found her, and she saw Samuel in the cold calculation of his gaze. "Margaret, we've been worried sick. When you left without word, I wrote to say I was going to California." "To your sister, yes, I found the letter." His smile was thin as paper. "But you forgot to mention you'd sold the farm, Samuel's farm, the family farm." "It was mine to sell. Samuel left it to me." "Did he?" Marcus dismounted, keeping his hands visible but moving with the confidence of a man who had 20 guns at his back. "Funny thing about wills, they're only valid if the death is natural." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Cain shifted slightly, positioning himself between Margaret and the colonel. The other men tensed, hands drifting toward weapons. "What are you implying?" "Holstead." "Reverend." Winters stepped forward, his minister's collar lending him authority. "Mrs. Caldwell is a widow in mourning. Have you no decency?" Marcus ignored him, his eyes never leaving Margaret. "The sheriff in Independence found some interesting things when he examined my brother's body. Bruises that didn't match a fall. And the neighbors, well, They had stories to tell about sounds in the night, about my brother's temper, about a wife who'd gotten too quiet. "Self-defense isn't murder," Margaret said quietly. The words escaped before she could stop them, and she saw triumph flash in Marcus's eyes. "So you admit?" "I admit nothing." She lifted her chin, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "Your brother fell down the stairs. The sheriff ruled it an accident. That's the end of it." "Is it?" Marcus took another step forward. "Because I have a different theory. I think you killed him for the farm, and I think Kansas law might see it the same way, especially with the right encouragement." Kane's rifle swung up, aimed at Marcus's chest. "That's far enough." Marcus studied Kane with interest. "And who might you be her new paramour? That was fast work. Margaret?" "I'm the man telling you to ride on," Kane said evenly. "The lady's made her position clear." "The lady," Marcus said, tasting the word like something bitter, "is coming with me, one way or another." The morning air crackled with tension. 22 guns against Kane's rifle and Margaret's hidden pistol. The Winters family huddled by their wagon, the children crying softly. "Mrs." Patterson stood frozen, reliving her own fresh grief. Then Margaret laughed. It started as a chuckle and built into something wild and free. She laughed until tears came, until the men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, until even Marcus stepped back. "You want to know what happened to Samuel?" she said when she could speak again. "Fine, I'll tell you. He came home drunk again, angry about something, the cards, a deal gone wrong. Who knows? It was always something. He grabbed me by the throat, like he'd done a dozen times before, but this time, I fought back. I pushed him, and yes, he fell down those stairs." She walked forward, past Kane's protective stance, until she stood face to face with Marcus. "I listened to him die," she continued, her voice steady now. "Listened to him choke on his own blood while his neck bent wrong. And you know what? I felt relief. For the first time in 5 years. I could breathe without fear. So yes, take me back if you can. Put me before a judge. Let me tell the world what kind of man Samuel Caldwell really was." Marcus's face had gone pale. "You're admitting to murder in front of witnesses." "I'm admitting to surviving." Margaret pulled back her collar, revealing old scars on her neck. "Would you like to see more evidence? I have years' worth." "Samuel would never." "Samuel did, often. Ask anyone who really knew us. Ask the doctor who set my ribs twice. Ask the minister's wife who gave me refuge when I couldn't go home." She let her collar fall back. "Or keep believing your brother was a good man. I don't care anymore." The silence stretched taut. Then Marcus made his mistake. His hand dropped to his gun. Kane moved like lightning, his rifle butt catching Marcus in the temple. The colonel dropped, and suddenly everyone was moving. Guns cleared leather, hammers cocked, and death hung by a thread. "Stop." Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. She stood over Marcus's unconscious form, her own pistol now visible and aimed at the nearest rider. "No one else dies for the Caldwell family," she said. "You want justice, fine, but not here, not with innocent blood." The lead rider, a scarred man with sergeant stripes on his civilian coat, held up a hand to calm the others. "What do you propose, ma'am?" Margaret felt Kane tense beside her, ready to fight 20 men if necessary. The knowledge steadied her. "You take your colonel and ride out," she said. "I'll continue to California. If the law wants me, they know where to find me. But this ends here." The sergeant considered, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough, but if you run—" "I'm done running," Margaret said. "From anything." It took time to sort out. Marcus revived and helped onto his horse. Weapons slowly lowered, hard looks exchanged. But eventually, the riders turned east, their dust cloud diminishing until the prairie swallowed them whole. Margaret's legs gave out. She sat hard on the ground, the pistol falling from nerveless fingers. Kane knelt beside her, his hands hovering uncertain. wanting to help but not knowing how. "That was foolish," he said roughly. "They could have—" "They could have," she agreed. "But they didn't." "Reverend." Winters approached, his family trailing behind. "Mrs. Caldwell, what you said about Samuel was the truth." She looked up at him, too exhausted to care about propriety. "Does that shock you, Reverend?" "No," he said quietly. "It saddens me that you suffered alone, that you felt you had no choice, but—" "I had choices," Margaret interrupted. "I could have left, could have run to my sister years ago, but I stayed, kept thinking it would get better. He would change. I could fix him." She laughed bitterly. "The only thing that changed was how good I got at hiding bruises." Emma Winters knelt beside her, taking her hand. "You're safe now. That's what matters." "Safe?" Margaret tested the word, found it strange on her tongue. She looked at Cain, still hovering protectively close, and wondered if safe was even possible for people like them. That night, they made camp by the spring again, too shaken to travel further. Margaret found herself by the fire, staring into the flames. The others gave her space, even the children sensing something fragile in the air. Cain appeared from the darkness, moving with his usual silence. He set something beside her, a cup of coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute they'd been drinking. "Where did you—" "Emergency supply," he said, settling himself across from her. "Figured this qualified." She sipped the coffee, letting its warmth chase away the chill that had nothing to do with temperature. They sat quietly, the fire popping between them, the spring murmuring its endless song. "Thank you," she said finally, "for standing with me." "You stood first," he pointed out. "I just followed your lead." "Still," she met his eyes across the flames. "No one's done that for me in I can't remember how long." He shifted uncomfortably. "You told them the truth about your husband." "Part of it." Margaret stared into her cup. "The rest, some stories don't need telling." "No," he agreed. "They don't." She heard the weight in his voice, the recognition of one survivor to another. Whatever had driven him from the cavalry, whatever orders he couldn't follow, those were his untold stories, his private ghosts. "Do you think they'll come back?" Cain considered. "Maybe, probably. Men like that don't give up easy." He paused. "You could still run. Head north instead of west. Canada, maybe." "I meant what I said. I'm done running." She set down the empty cup. "Whatever comes, I'll face it, even if it means hanging." The blunt question should have frightened her. Instead, she found herself almost smiling. "We all hang eventually, Mr. Cain, one way or another. At least this way. I choose the rope." He studied her across the fire, and she saw something shift in those stone-gray eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "Elijah," he said quietly. "What?" "You saved my life today. Least you can do is use my given name." This time she did smile, a real expression that transformed her face. "All right, Elijah." The sound of his name in her voice did something to him. She saw it in the way he stilled, the way his breath caught. For a moment, the walls came down, and she glimpsed the man beneath, lonely, haunted, but achingly human. Then the moment passed. He stood abruptly, rifle in hand. "Get some rest," he said gruffly. "We move at first light." She watched him disappear into his self-appointed watch, understanding the retreat. They were both too damaged for whatever was building between them, too sharp-edged to touch without drawing blood. But as she lay in her wagon that night, listening to the spring and the wind and the distant cry of wolves, Margaret found herself thinking about the way he'd said her name, like it was something worth protecting, like she was something worth protecting. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without checking that her pistol was within reach. They parted ways with the Winters family at Fort Laramie. Reverend. Winters pressed her hand warmly, his wife embracing her with tears in her eyes. Even Mrs. Patterson, emerging from her fog of grief, whispered a blessing for her journey. You could stay, Emma Winters said one last time. Find work in the fort. Start fresh here. Margaret glanced at Elijah, who stood apart with his paint mare, checking supplies he'd traded for at the fort. He hadn't said he was continuing with her, but he hadn't said goodbye either. I have a sister waiting, Margaret said softly, and promises to keep. As the Winters wagon rolled through the fort gates, Margaret stood alone in the dusty street, her single carpetbag at her feet. The sale of the Patterson wagon had given her enough for supplies, and a horse, a sturdy bay mare with gentle eyes and steady gait. Elijah appeared at her shoulder, silent as always. You know the way to California? He asked. I'll follow the established trails. Trails are where the trouble finds you. He studied the horizon, then seemed to make a decision. There's another route, harder but safer. Through the mountains. And you know this route. I know it. They looked at each other, the invitation hanging unspoken between them. Margaret felt she should protest, maintain some pretense of propriety. Instead, she heard herself say, When do we leave? Something like relief flickered across his features. Now, if you're ready. They rode out as the sun peaked, two figures against the vast canvas of Wyoming territory. Margaret had traded her black widow's dress for practical clothing, split skirt, cotton shirt, leather vest. The transformation felt like shedding old skin. Elijah led them away from the main trail, following creek beds and game paths. He taught her to read the land, how to find water by watching birds, how to recognize the plants that could heal or harm, how to move quietly through the sage. Keep your weight centered, he instructed as they navigated a steep descent. Trust the horse. She knows her business better than you do. Margaret gripped the saddle horn, feeling every muscle protest. She'd ridden before, but never like this. Never for hours on end through untamed country. How do you know all this? My mother's people. The admission came reluctantly. Cheyenne. She died when I was young, but she taught me enough. It was the most he'd shared about his past. Margaret stored the information carefully, adding it to her small hoard of knowledge about Elijah Kane. They made camp that first night by a stream bordered with willows. Elijah showed her how to build a fire that gave heat without smoke, how to arrange stones to reflect warmth, how to position their bedrolls to catch morning sun but avoid evening dew. You're patient, she observed as he corrected her fumbling attempts at knots. Were you a teacher before the army? His hands stilled. I was a lot of things before the army. He finished the knot with quick efficiency. None of them matter now. Margaret recognized the wall going up, the retreat into silence. She'd done it enough herself, but something about the firelight and the vastness of sky made her bold. I was 17 when I married Samuel, she said, feeding small sticks to the fire. My father owed him money, gambling debts. Samuel offered to forgive them in exchange for, she gestured at herself, a bargain, he called it. Everyone got what they wanted. Except you. Except me. She watched sparks rise into darkness. I tried to be a good wife, tried to love him, or at least understand him. But Samuel didn't want love. He wanted possession, something he could control absolutely. Elijah's jaw tightened. Some men are like that. See gentleness as weakness, kindness as something to exploit. He taught me things, though, Margaret continued. How to shoot, how to ride, how to keep accounts. Said a frontier wife needed skills. I think he liked the idea of molding me, creating his perfect woman. She laughed bitterly. He created something, all right, just not what he expected. They sat in companionable silence, the fire dying to coals. When Elijah spoke again, his voice was low, meant for darkness and confession. I killed my commanding officer. Margaret didn't gasp or pull away. She simply waited, giving him the space to continue. He ordered us to fire on a Cheyenne village. Women and children. Said they were harboring hostiles. But I knew better. It was winter camp. Families. Some of them. He swallowed hard. Some of them could have been my mother's kin. You refused. I refused. Others didn't. His hands clenched and unclenched. When the smoke cleared, 37 dead. Most of them under 10 years old. That night, I found the major in his tent, drunk, celebrating, calling it a great victory. Margaret reached across the space between them, her fingers barely touching his hand. He didn't pull away. I didn't plan it, he continued. But I saw him there, saw his smile, and something in me just broke. They called it self-defense at the court-martial. Said he'd drawn first. That was true enough, he always was a mean drunk. But I went there hoping he would. You sought justice. I sought revenge. There's a difference. He turned his hand palm up, letting her fingers rest against his. They couldn't prove murder, but they knew. Gave me a choice, hang for desertion or disappear. So I disappeared. Margaret understood the weight he carried now, the ghost that rode with him. Not so different from her own. Do you regret it? I regret a lot of things. That isn't one of them. As the days passed, they fell into rhythm. Rise before dawn. Ride till noon, rest through the worst heat. Ride again till dusk. Elijah taught her survival. And she surprised them both with how quickly she learned. You're tougher than you look, he said one evening as she field-dressed a rabbit he'd snared. Her hands no longer shook at the sight of blood. I had to be, she replied simply. They were climbing now, the land rising toward distant peaks. The air grew thin and cold. At night, they built their fires closer together, their bedrolls arranged for shared warmth. Still, they maintained careful distance, a boundary neither quite ready to cross. But awareness grew between them like spring grass after fire. Margaret found herself watching the way he moved, economical and graceful, the way morning light caught in his dark hair, the rare moments when his guard dropped and she glimpsed the man beneath the armor. He watched her too. She felt his eyes when she braided her hair, when she tended the horses, when she practiced with her pistol he'd insisted on daily training, making her shoot until her aim was true at any distance. Why are you helping me? She asked one night. They were camped high in the foothills, the plains spread below like a rumpled quilt. You could have ridden on after Fort Laramie, been free of my troubles. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, maybe I'm tired of being free. She turned to look at him, finding his gray eyes already on her. The firelight flickered between them, casting shadows that danced and merged. Freedom's all I wanted for so long, she admitted. Now I have it, and I don't know what to do with it. You learn, he said, day by day, choice by choice. You learn who you are when no one's forcing you to be something else. Who are you? Elijah Kane. He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his weathered features. Still figuring that out. Me too. The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious. Then a wolf howled in the distance, and Elijah reached for his rifle, the spell broken. But something had shifted. The careful distance remained. But it was different now, a choice rather than a wall. They were two damaged people learning to exist in the same space without cutting each other on their broken edges. One morning, Margaret woke to find fresh snow dusting the ground. Elijah was already up, studying the sky with concern. Storm coming, he said. We need to find better shelter. They pushed hard that day, climbing higher as the wind picked up. By afternoon, snow fell in thick curtains. Margaret could barely see Elijah's back ahead of her, the world reduced to white and cold. He led them to a cave he'd apparently known about, a deep cleft in the rock partially concealed by pine growth. They brought the horses inside, grateful for the shelter and warmth of the animals. As night fell and the storm raged outside, they sat close by their small fire. The cave walls glowed orange, creating a world unto itself. Margaret shivered despite the warmth, reaction setting in from the day's fear and exertion. Without words, Elijah moved closer, opening his coat in invitation. After a moment's hesitation, she accepted. Settling against his side, he was solid and warm, smelling of leather and wood smoke and something uniquely him. "Thank you," she whispered. His arm came around her, careful and protective. "Sleep," he said roughly. "I'll keep watch." But she felt his breathing change as exhaustion took him too, his body relaxing against hers. For the first time in memory, Margaret felt truly safe, protected not by walls or weapons, but by the simple presence of another human who asked nothing of her but companionship. Outside, the storm howled its fury. Inside, two souls found temporary peace in the shelter of each other's warmth. When morning came, bringing clear skies and pristine snow, they pulled apart with careful courtesy. Neither spoke of the night, of the boundary crossed and quietly rebuilt. But something fundamental had changed. They were no longer traveling companions thrown together by circumstance. They were partners, bound by choice and growing trust. Margaret looked at the trail ahead, no longer seeing an escape route, but a path forward. Beside her, Elijah checked his rifle and adjusted his hat, preparing for another day's journey. "Ready?" he asked. She mounted her horse, sitting tall in the saddle. The woman who'd fled Missouri and widow's weeds was gone. In her place sat someone new-scarred but not broken, cautious but not afraid. "Ready," she said, and meant it. They rode into the morning sun, two figures against the snow, no longer alone. The first sign of trouble came 3 days after the storm, fresh horse tracks crossing their path, too many to be innocent travelers. Elijah dismounted to study them, his face darkening. "Shod horses, at least a dozen riders." He looked up at Margaret. "Moving parallel to us since yesterday." "Marcus." "Could be, or could be someone else entirely." He swung back into the saddle. "Either way, we're being hunted." They changed course, heading deeper into the mountains where the terrain would favor 2 riders over a larger group. Margaret felt the familiar knot of fear in her stomach but pushed it down. She'd come too far to be dragged back now. That night they made cold camp, no fire, just dried meat and water, huddled beneath an overhang of rock. Margaret dozed fitfully against Elijah's shoulder, starting at every sound. "You should go on without me," she whispered during one of her wakeful moments. "This isn't your fight." His arm tightened around her. "You ever try to leave a wounded wolf in the woods?" "I'm not wounded." "No," he agreed. "You're something more dangerous. You're healing." She turned to look at him in the darkness, seeing only the glint of his eyes. "Elijah?" "They're not just hunting you," he said quietly. "Word of a deserter traveling with a woman would have reached every fort by now. We're both marked." The truth of it settled between them. Somewhere in the past weeks, their fates had become intertwined. There was no longer her trouble, and his there was only theirs. Dawn brought confirmation of their fears. Smoke rose from the valley below, multiple campfires marking where their pursuers had spent the night. Through Elijah's field glasses, Margaret counted 15 men. "That's not Marcus," she said, recognizing none of the faces. "Those men are too rough for his tastes." "Bounty hunters, then." Elijah lowered the glasses. "Someone's put a price on one of us, or both." They pushed the horses hard that day, climbing switchback trails that made Margaret's head spin. Her bay mare stumbled once, sending rocks cascading into the void below. Only Elijah's quick grab of the bridle kept them from following. "We can't keep running like this," Margaret gasped when they finally stopped to rest the animals. "The horses won't last." Elijah studied the landscape with the intensity of a man reading scripture. "There's a place, My mother's people called it the Eagle's Nest, natural fortress, if we can reach it. How far? 2 days hard riding, but there's another problem. He met her eyes. It's sacred ground, bringing trouble there. Margaret understood the weight of what he was considering violating his mother's heritage to save their lives. We'll find another way, she said firmly. There is no other way. His voice was heavy with resignation. She would understand. The living matter more than old taboos. They rode through the night, navigating by moonlight and instinct. Margaret dozed in the saddle, trusting her mare to follow Elijah's paint. She dreamed of Samuel's face, twisted in death, and woke to find tears frozen on her cheeks. The second night, their pursuers gained ground. Gunshots echoed off canyon walls, not aimed, just announcements. We're coming. We know where you are. They're trying to panic us, Elijah said. Make us run blind. But Margaret heard what he didn't say, that soon the hunters would be close enough for those shots to find marks. They reached the Eagle's Nest as dawn painted the peaks crimson. It was as Elijah had described, a natural bowl in the mountains, accessible only through a narrow defile. Ancient petroglyphs marked the entrance, warnings or welcomes in a language Margaret couldn't read. Forgive me, Elijah murmured, whether to his mother's spirit or the old gods of this place. Margaret wasn't sure. They led the horses through the passage into a hidden meadow. A spring bubbled from the rocks, feeding a small pool. The walls rose sheer on all sides except the entrance, one way in, one way out. If they trap us here, Margaret began, then we make our stand. Elijah was already assessing defensive positions. Better ground than we'll find anywhere else. They worked quickly, gathering ammunition, filling water containers, positioning themselves where they could command the entrance. Margaret's hands shook as she loaded her pistol, but her resolve was steady. I won't go back, she said. Whatever happens, I won't let them take me back to that life. Elijah paused in his preparations, crossing to where she stood. His hands framed her face, calloused thumbs gentle against her skin. No one's taking you anywhere, he said fiercely. You're not alone anymore. The words broke something in her, some last wall she'd built against hope. She leaned into him, feeling his strength, offering her own in return. Neither are you, she whispered. The moment shattered as horses' hooves echoed through the defile. Their pursuers had found them. Stay low, Elijah instructed, moving to his position. Don't fire until you have a clear shot. Make every bullet count. The first rider appeared in the passage, then another. Margaret recognized the type hard men who made their living on others' misfortune. Behind them, she glimpsed a face that made her blood run cold. Elijah, she called softly. The man in the blue coat, that's Lieutenant Morrison from Fort Laramie. His face went granite hard. Army and bounty hunters, someone wants us bad. Morrison's voice carried across the meadow. Kane misses. Caldwell. We know you're in there. Come out peaceable and this ends clean. Define clean, Elijah called back. You'll both get trials, fair and legal. That's more than some would offer. Margaret laughed, high and bitter. Fair trials for a deserter and a murderess. We know how those end. Lieutenant. Then you know fighting is pointless. We've got you outnumbered and outgunned. Elijah's rifle spoke his answer, the shot sparking off the rocks near Morrison's head. The lieutenant dove for cover as his men scattered. Eloquent, as always. Margaret murmured, sighting down her pistol. The battle erupted in earnest. Gunfire thundered through the enclosed space, echoing off stone walls until Margaret's ears rang. She fired carefully, making each shot count as Elijah had taught her. A man cried out and fell from his horse. Another clutched his shoulder and retreated. But there were too many. For every man they drove back, 2 more appeared. Their ammunition wouldn't last forever. The horses, Elijah said suddenly. If they get past us, they'll shoot the horses. We'll be trapped on foot. Margaret understood. Without mounts, they'd never escape these mountains. She left her covered position, running crouched toward where they'd picketed the animals. Bullets whined past, chipping stone, but she reached the horses and began leading them to better shelter. A man appeared above her on the rocks. One of the hunters had climbed the cliff face. His gun swung toward her, and Margaret knew with cold certainty that she couldn't draw in time. The shot came from behind her. The hunter tumbled from his perch, and Margaret turned to see Elijah standing exposed, smoke rising from his rifle. As she watched, he jerked and stumbled, red blooming across his shirt. "No!" The word tore from her throat. She abandoned the horses, running to where he'd fallen behind a boulder. Blood seeped between his fingers where he pressed against his side. "Just a graze," he said through gritted teeth, but she saw the lie in his eyes. The firing intensified. Morrison's men had found their courage, pressing forward through the passage. Soon they'd be in the meadow proper, and then it would be over. Margaret made her choice. "Can you ride?" Elijah nodded, though the movement clearly pained him. She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight. "The back wall," he gasped. "There's a trail, narrow, dangerous, but possible." She'd seen no trail, but she trusted his knowledge. Half dragging him, she retreated toward the horses. Her pistol barked twice more, driving back the boldest of their attackers. The trail was barely a goat path, a thread of possibility along the cliff face. One misstep would mean death on the rocks below, but death waited behind them too, in the forms of hard men with harder purposes. "Take the paint," Elijah insisted. "She knows mountains." "We take both or neither," Margaret shot back. She got him into the saddle, tying him in place with her own belt when he swayed. Then she mounted her bay and took the paint's lead rope. "Margaret." Morrison had entered the meadow, his men spreading out behind him. "This is your last chance. Surrender now, and I guarantee safe passage to trial." She looked at the lieutenant, then at Elijah slumped over his horse's neck, then at the impossible trail ahead. "I already told you," she called back. "I won't go back to that life." She fired her last shots into the air, spooking the hunters' horses into chaos. In the confusion, she urged her mount onto the narrow trail, pulling Elijah's paint behind. The path was a nightmare loose shale, crumbling edges, drops that yawned like hungry mouths. Behind them, shouts and sporadic gunfire. But Morrison's men balked at following onto the treacherous trail. Step by step, yard by yard, they climbed. Margaret kept up a steady stream of encouragement, as much for herself as for the horses or the semi-conscious man they carried. "Just a little further, that's it, good girl. We're almost there." Almost where, she didn't know, but movement was life, and stopping was death. So they pressed on. The trail widened slightly as they crested a ridge. Margaret risked a look back and saw no immediate pursuit. Morrison would have to find another way round, and that would take time. "Elijah," she reached over to touch his face, finding it cold and clammy. "Stay with me." His eyes fluttered open, focusing with effort. "Stubborn woman," he mumbled. "Stubborn man," she countered, tears blurring her vision. They rode on as the sun climbed toward noon. Two small figures against the vastness of stone and sky. Behind them lay the life that had tried to reclaim them. Ahead waited uncertainty, danger, possibly death. But also possibility, also freedom, also each other. Margaret gripped the reins tighter and urged the horses forward. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The mountains swallowed them whole, keeping their secrets in halls of stone and silence. The cave appeared like salvation, a dark mouth in the cliff face, sheltered by an overhang of rock. Margaret half carried, half dragged Elijah inside, her strength born of desperation. The horses stood exhausted at the entrance, heads hanging low. Blood had soaked through Elijah's shirt, darker than the red earth outside. Margaret's hands shook as she cut away the fabric, revealing the wound. Not just a graze, the bullet had torn through his side, missing vital organs by inches but leaving damage enough. Need to cauterize it, Elijah managed through clenched teeth. Margaret knew what that meant. She'd seen Samuel do it once to a wounded horse. The memory made her stomach turn. But she pushed it down. This was Elijah, not some animal, and she wouldn't lose him now. She built a small fire with their remaining matches and heated his knife blade until it glowed. Their eyes met across the flames. "This will hurt," she warned. "Already hurts." He attempted a smile. "Do it?" The smell of burning flesh filled the cave. Elijah's body went rigid, a strangled cry escaping before he bit down on the leather strap she'd given him. Then merciful unconsciousness took him. Margaret cleaned and bound the wound with strips torn from her petticoat, her movements steady despite the tears streaming down her face. When finished, she covered him with both their blankets and sat vigil, pistol in hand, watching the cave entrance. Night fell like a curtain. In the darkness, every sound became a threat. The wind might be riders approaching. The settling of stones could herald attack. Margaret fought exhaustion, splashing cold water on her face, pacing the small space. Elijah stirred near dawn, his fever breaking in a cold sweat. His eyes found her in the gray light. "You stayed. Where would I go?" She helped him drink from their canteen. "We're partners. Remember?" He gripped her hand weakly. Partners. By full daylight, she could assess their situation. One canteen of water remained. Their food consisted of a handful of dried meat and some berries she'd gathered days ago. Elijah needed rest and proper medicine, neither of which this cave could provide. "There's a town," he said when she explained their predicament. "Grafton, 2 days west, small. Might not have heard." 2 days. Margaret looked at him, pale and weak despite his attempts to hide it. He couldn't ride 2 hours, let alone 2 days. "I'll go," she decided. "Bring back supplies, medicine." "No." His hand caught her arm. "Too dangerous. Morrison's men. We'll be watching the main trails. I'll go careful, like you taught me." She covered his hand with hers. "Trust me, Elijah. I can do this." He studied her face. Seeing the woman she'd become no longer the frightened widow fleeing Missouri, but someone forged by trial and necessity. "Take the paint," he said finally. "She'll bring you back safe." Margaret prepared carefully. She took Elijah's rifle and her pistol, leaving him the remaining ammunition. Their last bit of food went into her saddlebag, he protested, but she ignored him. The memory of his protection would sustain her better than dried meat. 2 days, she promised, touching his face. "Keep the fire low. Save the water." "Margaret." His voice stopped her at the cave entrance. "If something happens, don't come back for me." She turned, meeting his eyes steadily. "That's not how partnerships work." The descent from the mountains felt like emerging from another world. Margaret kept to the high country as long as possible, following game trails and creek beds. Elijah had taught her well how to read the sky for weather, how to move without skyling herself on ridges, how to listen for the difference between natural sounds and human presence. By evening, she reached the wagon road to Grafton. The temptation to follow it pulled at her faster, easier, direct. But Elijah's voice echoed in her mind. Easy paths are where trouble finds you. She paralleled the road instead, staying in the trees. Good thing. 2 dust clouds marked riders moving fast toward town, whether Morrison's men or ordinary travelers. She couldn't risk finding out. Grafton appeared near sunset the second day, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the prairie wind. Margaret studied it from a hilltop, planning her approach. The general store would have medical supplies, but also questions. A woman alone, buying medicines for bullet wounds that would be remembered. She waited for full dark, then rode in quietly. The saloon spilled light and noise into the street, providing cover. She tied the paint behind the general store and tried the back door. Locked, of course. The window, however, yielded to her knife, another skill Elijah had taught her, though he'd probably not intended it for burglary. She slipped inside, moving by feel and moonlight. Carbolic acid, laudanum, clean bandages, ammunition. She took only what they desperately needed, leaving money on the counter, more than the goods were worth. But theft sat uneasy on her conscience, even justified theft. She was reaching for dried beans when voices approached the front door. Margaret froze, heart hammering. The lock rattled. "Swear I heard something," a man's voice said. "Probably just Walton's dogs," another replied. "Come on, Morrison's buying drinks for information about them fugitives." Morrison, here in Grafton. Margaret barely breathed until the voices moved away. Then she grabbed the remaining supplies and fled through the window. The paint mare waited patiently, ears pricked at her approach. Margaret mounted and walked the horse slowly out of town, every nerve screaming to gallop. But haste would draw attention. So she held to a steady pace until buildings gave way to open country. Then she rode like the devil himself pursued her. The return journey blurred into a nightmare of exhaustion and fear. Morrison and Grafton meant they knew the general area. Soon they'd expand their search, find the cave, find Elijah helpless and fevered. She pushed the paint harder than wise, stopping only when the mare stumbled, then walking, leading the exhausted animal, pressing on through sheer will. Dawn of the second day found her at the cave entrance. Terror seized her at the silence within. No fire glow, no movement. "Elijah." A gunhammer clicked in the darkness, then his voice, hoarse but alive. "Stubborn woman, told you, not to come back." Relief buckled her knees. She found him propped against the cave wall, pistol trained on the entrance until he recognized her. The fever had returned. She saw, but he was conscious, alert. "Morrison's in Grafton," she said, already unpacking medical supplies. "We can't stay here." "I know." He gestured weakly toward the cave mouth. "Saw riders yesterday, far off, but searching, getting closer." Margaret cleaned and redressed his wound, relieved to find no infection despite the fever. The carbolic burned, making him hiss through his teeth, but the laudanum eased the worst of it. "Can you ride?" she asked when finished. "Do I have a choice?" They packed quickly, Margaret doing most of the work while Elijah saved his strength. She helped him onto his horse, noting how his hands shook on the reins. "Where?" she asked. He pointed northwest, toward peaks shrouded in morning mist. "There's a place, old mining camp, abandoned, but shelter." They rode through the morning, keeping to difficult terrain that would slow pursuit. Elijah swayed in the saddle but stayed mounted, pure determination keeping him upright. Margaret rode close, ready to catch him if he fell. The attack came at a river crossing. 5 men erupted from the cottonwoods, guns drawn, horses fresh. Not Morrison's soldiers, but the bounty hunters, eager for reward and unconstrained by military protocol. "Drop the weapons!" their leader shouted. A scarred man with dead eyes. Margaret's hand found her pistol, but Elijah was already moving, wounded or not. His reflexes remained lightning quick. His rifle spoke twice, dropping 2 men before they could react. The river exploded in chaos. Horses screamed, men shouted. Gunfire echoed off the water. Margaret's pistol bucked in her hand as she fired at shapes in the smoke. A man toppled from his saddle. Another clutched his arm and wheeled away. "Ride," Elijah roared. They plunged into the river, icy water shocking the horses into greater speed. Bullets sparked off rocks, fountained in the current. The paint mare stumbled, nearly going down, but Margaret hauled her head up and kicked her forward. They burst from the water on the far bank, the horses laboring up the steep slope. Margaret looked back to see Elijah still in the saddle, but slumped forward, fresh blood staining his shirt. Only one hunter remained mounted, pursuing doggedly. Margaret turned in her saddle, aimed carefully as Elijah had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The man jerked and fell, his horse veering away. They rode hard for another mile before Elijah finally collapsed, sliding from the saddle into Margaret's desperate arms. She lowered him to the ground, horrified by the blood, the pallor of his skin. "Go," he whispered. "Leave me." "Never." She pressed her hand against the reopened wound, trying to stem the flow. "You hear me, Elijah Kane, never." His hand covered hers, weak but warm, stubborn. "You love that about me," she said fiercely, not caring about propriety or walls or careful distance. Not now, not when she might lose him. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Yes. Margaret looked around wildly. They couldn't stay here, exposed on the open slope. But Elijah couldn't ride further, and she couldn't lift him alone. Then she saw a shelf of rock jutting from the hillside, creating an overhang. Not a cave, but shelter of sorts. She coaxed and dragged him into its protection, cushioning him with their blankets. "I'm going to fix this," she promised, though she didn't know how. "Just hold on." The sun climbed higher, and in the distance, she heard horses approaching. Morrison's men or more hunters. It didn't matter. They were out of time, out of options, out of miracles. Margaret checked her weapons. 3 bullets left in the pistol, 5 in Elijah's rifle. Not enough to win, but perhaps enough to make their last stand count. She positioned herself between Elijah and the approach road, weapons ready. Whatever came, they would face it as they'd faced everything else together. "Margaret," Elijah's voice was barely a whisper. "Need to tell you." "Save it," she said gently. "Tell me after." But they both knew there might not be an after. The hoofbeats grew louder, and Margaret raised the rifle, sighting down the barrel. Her hands were steady now, her purpose clear. She would protect him as he had protected her, and if they fell, they would fall together, free to the end. The riders crested the hill, and Margaret's finger found the trigger, ready to write their ending in thunder and flame. The riders stopped just out of rifle range, 6 men, dust-covered and hard-faced. Margaret recognized Lieutenant Morrison at their head, his uniform still crisp despite days on the trail. He raised a white handkerchief tied to his rifle barrel. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm coming forward to talk. Just talk." Margaret kept the rifle trained on him. "That's close enough, Lieutenant." Morrison dismounted, hands visible, and walked slowly forward until he stood 20 yards away, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough that she couldn't miss if she fired. "Your companion needs help," he said, nodding toward where Elijah lay. "I can see the blood from here. Let you hang him. You mean—" Margaret's voice was steady as granite. "After your trial, your justice." "The law is the law, ma'am, but dying out here serves no one." Morrison's face showed what might have been genuine concern. "I've got medical supplies, a man who knows doctoring. Whatever Kane's crimes, he doesn't deserve to bleed out in the dirt." Margaret felt Elijah stir behind her, heard his labored breathing. The rifle grew heavy in her arms, but she didn't lower it. "And me?" she asked. "What do I deserve? Lieutenant—" Morrison was quiet for a moment. "I've been asking questions in Grafton. Folks there remember you from before. Remember Samuel Caldwell, too. The doctor especially seems he treated you more than once for injuries that didn't match your stories." Margaret said nothing, waiting. "There's a woman runs the boarding house who recalls giving you shelter one winter night. Said Samuel came looking drunk and raging. Said you went back to him anyway, because that's what wives do." Morrison removed his hat, ran a hand through his hair. "I'm starting to think maybe the law isn't always the same as justice." "Pretty words, Lieutenant, but they won't change how this ends." "Maybe not, but I'd rather see you both live to face judgment than die here for pride." He gestured to his men. "I give you my word, no harm will come to either of you in my custody. You'll get fair treatment, Fair trials. Your word. Margaret laughed bitterly. Like the army's word to the tribes, like the law's word to women who defend themselves against brutal men. Behind her, Elijah struggled to sit up. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but carried clear in the mountain air. Morrison. The lieutenant's attention shifted. Kane, you were at Sand Creek. Morrison's face went rigid. I was... Then you know... What orders? I refused. I know. The admission seemed pulled from Morrison against his will. I was there. I followed orders. You didn't. Still follow them. In your dreams. Morrison flinched as if struck. For a moment, his careful military composure cracked, showing the haunted man beneath. Every night, he said quietly. Elijah managed to pull himself more upright, though the effort painted his face gray. Then you know, some things matter more than orders, more than law. The two men stared at each other across the distance. Veterans of the same horror, divided by the choices they'd made in its aftermath. Margaret watched understanding pass between them, the kind that came only from shared darkness. Morrison replaced his hat. Decision made. I'll report that we tracked you into the mountains, lost you in a storm. Hostiles in the area made pursuit impossible. He looked at Margaret. Mrs. Caldwell died in the mountains with the deserter Kane. Tragic end to a sad story. Margaret lowered the rifle slightly, hardly believing what she heard. Why? Because Kane was right. Some things matter more. Morrison turned to walk back to his men, then paused. There's an old mining town, Prosperity, about 50 miles northwest. Doc Hensley there doesn't ask questions if the price is right. After that, California's a big place, easy for the dead to disappear. He mounted his horse, gathered his men with a gesture. One of them protested Margaret caught fragments about duty, reward money. Morrison's reply was sharp and final. Military discipline held. The men fell in line. Lieutenant, Margaret called out. He turned in the saddle. Thank you. Morrison touched his hat brim. Ma'am. Then, to Elijah. You were a good soldier. Kane would have been a better one if the world was different. They watched the patrol ride away, dust settling in their wake like a curtain falling on the past. Only when they'd vanished completely did Margaret drop the rifle and turn to Elijah. He was conscious but fading, the brief exchange having cost him dearly. She knelt beside him, cradling his head in her lap. Hold on, she whispered. Prosperity, 50 miles. We can make that. His hand found hers, grip weak but determined. Margaret, don't, not yet. Tell me in Prosperity. Tell me in California. Tell me when we're old and safe and this is just a story we share by the fire. But he squeezed her hand, urgency in his fading strength. Need to, in case... No. She pressed her fingers to his lips. No last words. No goodbyes. You're going to live. Elijah Kane, because I'm too stubborn to let you die. Despite everything, he smiled. Stubborn woman. You're stubborn woman, she said fiercely, past caring about propriety or careful walls. So you'd better fight. You hear me, fight. The afternoon sun beat down as Margaret worked to get him back on his horse. She tied him in place again, using strips torn from her skirt, then mounted her own horse and took his reins. 50 miles, 2 days, maybe 3 with his condition. They rode through sunset into twilight, Margaret navigating by stars as Elijah had taught her. She talked to keep herself awake, to keep him anchored to consciousness. My sister Helen has a farm near Sacramento, orange groves. Can you imagine trees full of orange gold? Sweet as sunshine. She says the smell when they bloom is like nothing else on earth. Elijah made a sound that might have been acknowledgement. She married well, a banker who treats her kind. They have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. She writes that little Sarah looks like me. Same stubborn chin, she says. Margaret's voice caught. I haven't seen her in 8 years. Thought I never would again. They stopped only when the horses couldn't continue. Margaret made camp in a grove of aspens, their leaves whispering secrets to the night. She managed to get water into Elijah, a few drops of laudanum for the pain. His fever raged, skin burning under her touch. She lay beside him, sharing heat, sharing breath, willing her strength into his failing body. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human suffering, but Margaret found comfort in their constancy. They'd watched her flee Missouri, watched her find Elijah, watched them forge something from mutual damage. Perhaps they'd watch them survive this too. Dawn came slowly, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Elijah's fever had broken again, leaving him weak but lucid. He watched her pack their camp with eyes that held too much gratitude, pain, something deeper she wasn't ready to name. Thank you, he said as she helped him mount. No. She adjusted his position, making sure he was secure. Partners don't thank each other for doing what's necessary. The second day blurred into nightmare. Elijah drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling in languages she didn't recognize English. Cheyenne, the mixed tongue of his fractured heritage. Margaret pushed on, following game trails and creek beds, praying she was heading the right direction. Late afternoon brought them to a ridge overlooking a valley. Below, the remnants of prosperity clung to the hillside weathered buildings, abandoned mines, but also smoke from chimneys, signs of stubborn life. There, she breathed. We made it. Elijah, look, we made it. But he was past responding, slumped forward over the paint's neck, only the ropes keeping him mounted. Margaret urged the exhausted horses down the slope, praying the doctor Morrison mentioned was real, was skilled, was sober. The town watched their approach with the wariness of a place that had seen too much. A few figures emerged from doorways, curiosity overcoming caution. Margaret didn't care about their stares, their whispers. She cared only about the faded sign that read, Doc Hensley, Physician. She half fell from her horse, pounding on the door. Doctor, please, I need help. The door opened to reveal a thin man with intelligent eyes and steady hands. A good sign in a mining town doctor. Gunshot, he asked, already moving to help. Yes, 2 days ago, maybe more. I've lost track. They carried Elijah inside, the doctor calling for his assistant, a Chinese man who moved with quiet efficiency. Margaret hovered, trying to help, until Hensley gently but firmly pushed her toward a chair. Let me work. You've done your part. Time for mine. She sat, suddenly aware of her exhaustion, her hunger, the weight of days spent balanced between hope and despair. Through the surgery door, she heard the doctor's calm instructions, the clink of instruments, Elijah's occasional groan. Time stretched like taffy. The afternoon sun slanted through dirty windows, painting rectangles of light on the floor. Margaret dozed, jerked awake, dozed again. A woman brought her tea and bread, patting her shoulder with wordless sympathy. Finally, eternally, Doc Hensley emerged, wiping his hands on a blood-stained cloth. He'll live, he said simply. Tough as old leather, that one. Lost blood. Fighting infection. But he'll pull through. Margaret's knees buckled. The doctor caught her, guided her to a cot in the next room. Rest now. He's sleeping. Real sleep, not the fever kind. I'll watch him. She wanted to protest, to insist on staying awake, but her body had reached its limits. The cot was thin and lumpy, but it felt like clouds after days in the saddle. Her last thought before sleep took her was of Elijah's words, the one she hadn't let him say. Soon, she promised herself, soon, when they were both whole again, when the running was done. Soon she'd be brave enough to hear them, to speak her own in return. She woke to lamplight and a hand in hers. Elijah sat beside the cot, pale and bandaged, but undeniably alive. His gray eyes held depth she'd only glimpsed before, warmth and wonder and something that made her heart race. "Stubborn woman," he said softly. "You brought us through." "Stubborn man," she replied, squeezing his hand. "You stayed alive." They sat in the lamplight, hands joined, walls finally fallen. Outside, Prosperity went about its evening business, miners heading to saloons, wives calling children home, the endless dance of life in a hard place. But inside that small room, two battered souls found something they'd thought lost forever. Not peace that would come later, if at all. Not healing some wounds never fully closed, but connection, recognition, the bone-deep knowledge that they were no longer alone. "Margaret," Elijah began. "I know," she said. "Me too." And in the end, that was enough. Words could wait. California could wait. The future, uncertain as mountain weather, could wait. For now, they had this hands joined in lamplight, the miracle of survival, the promise of tomorrow. It was more than either had dared hope for. It was everything. They stayed in Prosperity for 2 weeks while Elijah healed. Doc Hensley proved worth his reputation, changing bandages daily and fighting off the infection that tried twice to take hold. Margaret paid him with the last of her money, and when that ran short, with her mother's wedding ring, the one thing of value she'd kept hidden from Samuel all those years. "It's just metal," she told Elijah when he protested. "Your life matters more than old memories." He watched her with those storm-gray eyes that saw too much. "Some memories are worth keeping. Then we'll make new ones." As Elijah grew stronger, they talked of the future. Real talk now, not the desperate promises of the wounded and fearful. Margaret read him parts of Helen's letters, painting pictures of California orchards and sunshine that seemed like fairy tales after the harsh mountain cold. "She says there's work for willing hands. The railroad's coming through, bringing opportunity." Margaret folded the letter carefully. "A man who knows horses, who can scout and track, there'd be place for such a man." "And his wife?" Elijah asked quietly. "Would there be place for her?" The word hung between them, wife. They'd danced around it for days, this question of what they were to each other. Partners, yes, survivors. Certainly, but this was something more, something that required choosing. Margaret met his eyes steadily. "Is that what I am, your wife? If you'll have me?" He shifted on the bed, reaching for her hand. "I know I'm not much of a prospect, mixed blood, army deserter, no family, no fortune, no—" She stopped his words with her fingers on his lips. "You're the man who saved my life, who taught me to save my own, who looked at me and saw something more than Samuel's widow or damaged goods." She traced the line of his jaw, feeling him tremble under her touch. "That's prospect enough for me." They were married 3 days later in Doc Hensley's parlor. The doctor served as witness, his Chinese assistant as best man. Margaret wore her traveling dress, cleaned and mended. Elijah stood straight despite the pull of healing wounds, his face grave with the weight of promises made. No minister blessed their union. Prosperity's preacher had drunk himself to death the previous winter. Instead, Doc Hensley read from a book of poetry, something about 2 roads diverging in a wood. It seemed fitting for 2 people who'd chosen the harder path and found each other along the way. "By the power vested in me by absolutely no one," Doc Hensley concluded with a wry smile, "I pronounce you husband and wife. God help you both." They left Prosperity the next morning, riding into a dawn that painted the mountains gold and crimson. Elijah sat his horse carefully but steadily, the worst of the healing behind him. Margaret rode beside him, no longer looking back at what they'd left behind. The trail to California stretched before them, 500 miles of desert and mountain and possibility. They took it slow, stopping often to rest, to water the horses, to simply exist in each other's company without the pressure of pursuit. At night, they shared a bedroll under stars that seemed to multiply in the clear air. Margaret learned the warmth of being held without fear, the safety of arms that protected rather than imprisoned. Elijah learned to accept tenderness, to lower guards he'd maintained so long he'd forgotten they were there. "Tell me about your mother," Margaret asked one night as they camped by a stream that would eventually find the sea. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "She was beautiful, laughed like water over stones. My father met her at a trading post. He was buying supplies for the army. She was there with her brothers." A pause. Old pain surfacing. They loved each other. Didn't matter that neither family approved. They ran off, built a cabin, had me. "What happened to them?" "Cholera took her when I was 7. Father tried to raise me alone, but the army kept calling him back. When he died in a skirmish, his family wanted nothing to do with his half-breed bastard. Mother's people had moved on. I belonged nowhere." Margaret pressed closer against his side. "You belong with me now." "Yes," he said simply. "I do." They crossed into California on a morning that smelled of sage and promise. The land changed, softening from harsh desert to rolling hills covered in golden grass. Trees appeared real trees, not the stunted things that clung to mountain stone. "Look," Margaret breathed, pointing to a valley spread below them. "Orange groves, just like Helen described." The neat rows of trees stretched toward a cluster of buildings, smoke rising peaceful from chimneys. Somewhere down there, her sister waited the family that had seemed lost forever now within reach. "You ready for this?" Elijah asked. Margaret considered. She was no longer the frightened woman who'd fled Missouri in widow's weeds. That person had died somewhere in the mountains, replaced by someone harder but also softer. Someone who'd learned that strength could coexist with tenderness. "I'm ready." They descended into the valley as afternoon shadows lengthened. The house, when they found it, was modest but well kept. Flowers blooming in window boxes. A woman emerged at the sound of horses older than Margaret remembered. Streaks of gray in hair once pure auburn, but unmistakably Helen. The sisters stared at each other across 8 years of silence. Then Helen was running. Skirts caught up, laughing and crying at once. They collided in the yard, holding tight as if to make up for all the lost embraces. "I thought you were dead," Helen sobbed. "When Samuel wrote that you were too ill to travel, I knew he was lying, but I couldn't. There was nothing I could—" "Shh," Margaret smoothed her sister's hair. "I'm here now. I survived." Helen pulled back, taking in Margaret's travel-worn appearance, the hardness around her eyes, the man sitting quiet on his horse. "Oh, Margaret, what happened to you?" "Life," Margaret said simply. "But I'm free now." She turned to Elijah, holding out her hand. "Helen, this is my husband, Elijah Kane." Helen's eyes widened, taking in Elijah's mixed heritage, his military bearing, the way he dismounted careful of still healing wounds. But she saw too how he looked at Margaret, how Margaret looked at him, two people who'd found safe harbor in each other. "Then he's my brother," Helen said firmly, extending her hand. "Welcome to California, Mr. Kane." The golden light of late afternoon blessed their meeting, this convergence of past and future. Inside the house, children's voices called for their mother. A man appeared, Helen's husband, round-faced and smiling, flower in his hair from helping with supper. "Stay," Helen urged. "Both of you. We have room. You can rest, heal, figure out what comes next." Margaret looked at Elijah, saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. They were tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of being alone. Perhaps it was time to stop. "Just for a while," Margaret said, "until we find our feet." But she was already imagining at a small house nearby. Elijah working with horses or scouting for the railroad. Herself helping Helen with the children or keeping accounts for local businesses. A quiet life, an ordinary life, the kind of life she'd thought Samuel had stolen forever. That night, sitting on Helen's porch with Elijah beside her, Margaret watched the stars appear one by one in the California sky. The same stars that had witnessed their flight, their fear, their falling in love. But they looked different here. Softer somehow. Less like cold judges and more like old friends. "Any regrets?" Elijah asked quietly. Margaret considered all that had brought them here, the violence, the death, the long miles of uncertainty. Samuel's face flickered in her memory. Twisted in rage, then twisted in death. She let the image go, feeling no guilt in its release. "No," she said finally. "No regrets." He lifted their joined hands, kissing her scarred knuckles. "Near you, I am no longer myself," he murmured, echoing words spoken in extremity, now repeated in peace. "I'm something better, something whole." "And I chose to follow you," Margaret replied. "Best choice I ever made." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their new home. Inside, Helen sang her children to sleep, the melody carrying on the warm air. Somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird cycled through its repertoire, trying on different voices until it found one that fit. Margaret understood the feeling. She'd been so many people: dutiful daughter, abused wife, desperate widow, unlikely warrior. Now, at last, she could simply be herself. Margaret Kane, survivor, wife, free woman. The future stretched before them. Uncertain as always, but no longer threatening. There would be challenges, there always were for people like them. People who didn't fit easy categories, but they would face them together. Two damaged souls who'd found strength in their shared scars. "Tomorrow," Elijah said, "we start building something new." "Together," Margaret agreed. And in the California darkness, under stars that blessed their new beginning, they began to believe it might actually be possible. That love could grow from ashes, that broken people could heal, that sometimes, against all odds, the ending could be happier than the beginning. They'd chosen each other in desperation. Now they chose each other in hope. And that, Margaret thought as she leaned into her husband's warmth, made all the difference. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the untamed American West. This story of Margaret and Elijah reminds us that even in our darkest moments, love and redemption are possible. Where are you listening to this tale? Please share in the comments below so we can connect with fellow travelers on this trail. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Margaret's incredible transformation. Did her courage inspire you? What would you have done in her boots? Let's keep these frontier stories alive together.